Welcome to the Crawcast. I'm your host, George Krawczak, and this is what happened in Week 15 of the NFL season. If you like this type of content, make sure to hit that subscribe button like it owes you money. Now let's get started. The first game was the Los Angeles Rams versus the San Francisco 49ers. The Rams won 12-6. The Rams' leading passer was Matthew Stafford, who threw for 160 yards. Their leading rusher was Kyren Williams, who rushed for 108 yards. And their leading receiver was Puka Nacua, who had 97 receiving yards. And for the 49ers, their leading passer was Brock Purdy, who had 142 yards and an interception. Their leading rusher was Isaac Guerendo, who had 57 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is George Kittle, who had 61 receiving yards. So for this game, Matthew Stafford really didn't play that well, but neither team's offense really played that good. It was more of a defensive showing. And you may ask, how did the Rams score 44 against the Bills, but only 12 against the 49ers? Plain and simple. The 49ers defense is just better, but the 49ers offense struggled a lot. Brock Purdy really didn't look good at all. The run game was struggling. Deebo Samuel looked horrible. He had a couple of drops and even tackled his own running back in the backfield. I believe that was Isaac Guerendo. He tackled in the backfield by accident. And then kind of the two big stories about this game is the Rams. Right now, it looks like they will make the playoffs. Their offense has been clicking very well this season, even though they struggled in this game. So they could be a threat in the playoffs. And then the other one is Devondre Campbell. Him quitting on the 49ers. The 49ers wanted him to go in, and he just said, nope, not going in, and left the game. So the one interesting thing about it is that I actually respect for the 49ers is that instead of cutting him and letting him potentially join a Super Bowl team, they're just going to suspend him for the rest of the year, which makes sense because you do not want to reward bad behavior, number one. And then also, number two, I think Devondre Campbell's career is just done, plain and simple. He was not good, but he had that one amazing season with the Packers. They paid him a lot of money, and then ever since then, he's just been terrible. He was bad with the Packers, so they cut him. And then he signed up the 49ers and effectively blamed for the Packers, saying he wasn't put in the right position, and the Packers were the reason why he was terrible. And then he went to the 49ers, and he's been pretty terrible with the 49ers so far. He is playing terrible, he's old, and he just quit on his team. So those three factors, I think, basically end his career as we know it. So overall, the 49ers, again, they're going to miss the playoffs. They've been playing horrible this week after coming off a really great game against the Bears. Yes, it's the Bears, and they're terrible. But overall, they're struggling. And the Rams, even though they played bad on offense, at least they're looking like they're going to win the division. And they could potentially be a threat come playoff time. Anything can happen in the playoffs. The next game is the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Cleveland Browns. The Chiefs won 21-7. The Chiefs' leading passer was Patrick Mahomes, who threw for 159 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Kareem Hunt, who had 45 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Xavier Worthy, who had 46 receiving yards. And for the Browns, their leading passer is Jameis Winston, who had 146 yards and 3 interceptions. Their leading rusher is Jerome Ford, who had 84 yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Jerry Jeudy, who had 108 receiving yards. So for this game, a couple of takeaways. Number one, this Chiefs offense still continues to struggle a lot. They got 6 turnovers in this game, yet were only able to score 21 points, which is pretty bad. And then Patrick Mahomes goes down with an injury. I believe it was a high ankle sprain, so he is injured, but I believe he could tough it out next week. But honestly, I think at this point, you're probably going to get the 1 seed. You're for sure going to make the playoffs. So just bench Patrick Mahomes for at least 1 week, maybe 2 weeks. Maybe Carson Wentz can help you because Patrick Mahomes really hasn't been playing that well and really hasn't been the reason why you're winning football games. So just bench him, let him heal, get healthy for the playoffs, and then bring him back maybe the final week of the season if that game even matters. And let because Carson Wentz, he really didn't, he only had 2 completions, but still, it feels like I think the way Patrick Mahomes is playing so subpar this year, I think Carson Wentz can probably play on that level, and the Chiefs can continue to work their magic and somehow barely win games with Carson Wentz. And then for the Browns, more struggles continue. Jameis Winston clearly isn't the answer, and you're probably going to have to try to get quarterback in the draft. Maybe you can be at the point where I was going to say maybe sign a quarterback in free agency, but they can't do that either because Deshaun Watson's contract basically makes him uncuttable. And so he has to be on your team for at least next year and possibly the next 2 years. So the Browns are just in a very bad situation. If they at least want to try to compete, they need someone like Joe Flacco, who's capable, cheap, and I just think they're in kind of a no-win situation, and they'll definitely have to go back to Deshaun Watson next year. And then for their running attack, Nick Chubb broke his foot and is out for the year. That's unfortunate, but I think this could potentially be a good thing in the sense that Nick Chubb clearly has not been himself and really has not been good this year. And so I understand broken foot, obviously bad, don't want it to happen, but maybe giving him essentially an extra year to kind of prepare and get back into better shape and help save his career, because that's the thing that's unfortunate about him, is that he right now he just doesn't seem like a capable NFL running back. He completely tore up his entire leg last year and entire knee, and just overall disastrous injury, and he just needs to get better, plain and simple. So maybe he can take this time, get healthier, and come back better than ever. But overall, if you're the Chiefs and Browns, you're kind of in the same spots as you started in before this game. So not much has changed. The next game is the Dallas Cowboys versus the Carolina Panthers. The Cowboys won 30-14. The Cowboys' leading passer is Cooper Rush, who had 214 yards and 3 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Rico Dowdle, who had 149 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is CeeDee Lamb, who had 116 yards and a touchdown. And for the Panthers, their leading passer is Bryce Young, who had 219 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher is Chuba Hubbard, who had 32 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Jalen Cocker, who had 110 receiving yards and a touchdown. So for this game, I think it is a little bit of a divide between the reality and what you wanted to happen. And I actually noticed that for me quite a bit in the sense that Bryce Young started playing better, and I think everyone wants Bryce Young to succeed because it is kind of a feel-good story in the sense you're picked top overall, very, very high, and then all of a sudden you just fail and play absolutely horrible. And then now he's starting to make a comeback and definitely playing better as of late. And you're like, okay, finally want Bryce Young to turn the corner and make it click and finally get a good win. And even though Bryce Young didn't play great, he didn't play terrible either. It's just that the whole team is terrible. The Panthers offense, their whole O-line's not good. Their whole defense is terrible. And the Cowboys are just simply better, plain and simple. So even though Bryce Young is playing better and making a promising start, the whole team is just still terrible. And then the Cowboys, you gotta be happy because you're still trying to make the playoffs, even though I think it's extremely, extremely unlikely for the Cowboys to make the playoffs. But they are starting to get better. And one thing that is very unfortunate is that they are probably going to have to get rid of Micah Parsons. Because basically before the season, they had a decision. CeeDee Lamb, Dak Prescott, and Micah Parsons. They could pay 2 of those 3, but they can't pay all 3. In my opinion, I thought they should have paid Dak Prescott and Micah Parsons, because I think it is easier to replace an elite wide receiver as opposed to an elite edge rusher and elite quarterback. So out of those 3 positions, edge rusher, quarterback, and wide receiver, I think wide receiver is easiest to replace. But they chose to pay CeeDee Lamb and Dak Prescott, and so they're probably going to have to let Micah Parsons walk, and that's going to be very interesting what team gets them. But overall, the Cowboys got to be happy with a good win, even though it's against a terrible Panthers team. Next game is the Miami Dolphins versus the Houston Texans. The Texans won 20-12. The Texans' leading passer was C.J. Stroud, who had 131 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Dare Ogunbowale, who had 35 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Joe Mixon, who had 33 receiving yards. And for the Dolphins, their leading passer was Tua, who had 196 yards, 1 touchdown, 3 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Devon Achane, who had 41 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Malik Washington, who had 52 receiving yards. So in this game, neither team really played great. The Dolphins, with Tua, he threw 2 really bad interceptions, and this was it felt like after coming back, Tua's been playing really, really great, and then this is just him reverting back to not playing good at all. The whole team kind of was terrible, although the Texans can't say much better about that. C.J. Stroud played horrible. They had no run game. Basically both these teams played terrible. And the Dolphins, you're kind of officially eliminated from the playoffs, it feels like. You're probably not going to make it. And then the Texans, yes, you won the division. Yes, you're going to make the playoffs. But I really struggle to find a way where they're not one and done. Because they seem a little bit like a worse version of the Chiefs in the sense that the Chiefs play bad and barely win, and now the Texans are playing even worse and still winning. And just overall, I don't think the Texans are a good team. CJ Stroud is definitely taking a major step back instead of a step up. And just overall, I think the Texans are in a lot of trouble. Their defense is playing decent, but I just think they're in a lot of trouble. And it's going to be very interesting how they finish out the season. The next game is the New York Jets versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jets won 32-25. The Jets' leading passer was Aaron Rodgers, who had 389 yards and 3 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Aaron Rodgers, who had 45 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Davante Adams, who had 198 yards and 2 touchdowns. And for the Jaguars, their leading passer was Mac Jones, who had 294 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Travis Etienne, who had 65 rushing yards. Their leading receiver is Brian Thomas Jr., who had 105 yards and 2 touchdowns. So in this game, the Jets' offense is really finally clicking how we thought it would. Aaron Rodgers played really great. Davante Adams played really great. And honestly, the one bad thing is that Aaron Rodgers, a 41-year-old Aaron Rodgers, should not be your team's leading rusher on the day. But he was moving around, and he played really well. And I do think the past couple of weeks he's been playing great to the point where maybe he's earned an opportunity for whoever the next head coach of the Jets being, saying, hey, we can win with Aaron Rodgers. We can play well with Aaron Rodgers. And so with some better coaching, let's try to win. But the flip side of that, the Jets defense just was horrible. Again, not good. Mac Jones played okay. Just this Jets defense is kind of the reason why they're losing, it feels like. They're just terrible. And with the Jaguars, Mac Jones really just played okay. Nothing special. And then Brian Thomas Jr. played really, really great. And honestly, at this point, he's at least got to be up there with Malik Nabers to who's been the best rookie wide receiver so far. He looks like an absolute stud and a great pick out of the Jaguars for the draft. For this game, neither of these teams are making the playoffs. Neither of these teams are very good. The Jets, you're just trying to build momentum for next year. And then the Jaguars, I think you're kind of happy with a loss because you're just trying to get the best pick overall that you can. The next game is the New Orleans Saints versus the Washington Commanders. The Commanders won 20-19. The Commanders' leading passer is Jayden Daniels, who had 226 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Jayden Daniels, who had 66 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Terry McLaurin, who had 73 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. For the Saints, their leading passer is Spencer Rattler, who had 135 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher was Kendre Miller, who had 46 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Marquez Valdes-Scantling, who had 64 receiving yards. So for this game, the Commanders won. They're ahead very easily, basically the entire game. And then the Saints came back. Jake Haener was playing terrible, and they eventually benched him for Spencer Rattler. And Spencer Rattler came in and definitely played better. It is one of those things where it was interesting. That was controversial at the end because the Commanders got down at about the 1-yard line, and then the clock stopped. Although I do think there was enough time for them to spike the ball, the clock did stop, and the Saints were unable to get the 2-point conversion. And so in this game, the Commanders are starting to play worse. They started really, really great, and then progressively got worse throughout the season. And then the Saints, without a quarterback, Alvin Kamara is now injured. Your defense hasn't been playing that great. So the Saints are just in trouble. It's going to be interesting if they keep Derek Carr or not. I think Derek Carr has definitely earned at least one more year. But overall, just the Saints are not in a good position. The Commanders, you're going to make the playoffs probably, but you just got to start playing better. And honestly, I do think this is a successful year. Nobody thought you'd be any good, and now you're probably going to make the playoffs with a rookie quarterback. So if Jayden Daniels can kind of do the reverse of CJ Stroud, instead of taking a step back, taking a step up, they can really be good for future years to come. The next game is the Baltimore Ravens versus the New York Giants. The Ravens won 35-14. The Ravens' leading passer was Lamar Jackson, who threw for 290 yards and 5 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Derrick Henry, who had 67 rushing yards, and their leading receiver was Rashad Bateman, who had 80 yards and 2 touchdowns. For the Giants, their leading passer is Tim Boyle, who had 123 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher is Tyrone Tracy, who had 31 rushing yards, and their leading receiver is Malik Neighbors, who had 81 receiving yards and a touchdown. So this game is pretty self-explanatory and plain and simple. One of the best teams in the NFL destroyed one of the worst teams in the NFL. Lamar Jackson looked really good. Derrick Henry looked pretty good. And that's kind of it. Like, the Giants look bad, like they've been looking bad all year. Who knows if Brian Daboll will get fired or not. I didn't think he should, but it's tough to say how much do you blame this on the bad quarterback play of Daniel Jones, Tim Boyle, Tommy DeVito, as opposed to bad coaching by Brian Daboll. Because Daboll did take them to the playoffs one year with Daniel Jones, and they did look really good. And their defense has been progressively getting more injured and playing worse. So it's going to be a tough decision for the Giants. Again, the Ravens, they kind of did what they should. Like, this game would be newsworthy if it was a close game or if the Giants somehow won, but it kind of happened how everyone expected it and probably how it should happen. But the one real interesting thing, is Diontae Johnson. So Diontae Johnson was suspended for a game because a couple weeks ago against the Eagles, he refused to go in. They asked him to go in, he just said no. And then now, the Ravens announced that they're suspending him for this game, or they've excused him for all week of practice. And is that just because there's some family matter, or is he just not wanting to practice? And so I can totally see him getting potentially either cut, or the Ravens going the Devondre Campbell way of the 49ers and just suspending him for the regular season, or the rest of the season. That's going to be very interesting how that goes, but it seems like a little bit of mess there, but maybe they don't really need him. The next game is the Bengals versus the Titans. The Cincinnati Bengals won 37-27. The Bengals' leading passer is Joe Burrow, who threw for 271 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher is Chase Brown, who had 97 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver is Ja'Marr Chase, who had 94 receiving yards. And for the Titans, their leading passer was Mason Rudolph, who had 209 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Tony Pollard, who had 45 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver is Tyjae Spears, who had 87 receiving yards and a touchdown. So in this game, the Bengals played pretty decent. Joe Burrow played decent. A step back from his great, basically MVP year this year, but he has been playing pretty good overall, even though this wasn't a great game. And the story to me is Jordan Battle. He had a great fumble recovery and should have returned it for a touchdown. And he gets on the 1-yard line, looks like he's about to celebrate, the ball changes the ball from his right hand to his left, and just drops the ball. It goes back out of the end zone. I'll talk about this more come Jonathan Taylor in the Colts game, but I do not understand how this happens. It is literally the dumbest, most inexcusable play in the NFL. I just don't get it. Like, if I was a coach, I'd say, okay, everybody, run to the back of the end zone. I don't care. Do not let the ball leave your hands before you cross that line. Just run to the back of the end zone. And it, again, I don't get it. It literally makes no sense. Like, I don't know if it was the first time doing this or not, but when Deshaun Jackson did that one time for the Eagles, everyone should have just saw that, laughed at him, and say, oh, what an idiot. That will never happen in the NFL ever again. And then the Jets wide receiver did it earlier this year, and a couple other players have done it, and then it happens 2 times this week. It makes no sense. It shouldn't have happened, and I don't understand it. So the Bengals, you still got to be a bit happy. You're going to probably not make the playoffs, but your offense is looking really good. And then the Titans, more woes for them. Will Levis really did not look good, and I thought he earned an opportunity to become their franchise guy. We'll see if there's going to be any good quarterbacks available and what the Titans draft pick will be. But now Will Levis is kind of playing his way out of becoming the Titans franchise guy. And it's really unfortunate, but that's kind of how it's going. It's just he's not playing well, and he has been struggling quite a lot, and he just needs to play better, plain and simple. And he might not get another opportunity because, yes, right now I think Mason Rudolph does give you a better opportunity to win. But at this point, let's be honest, Mason Rudolph is not going to be your franchise guy. And so at least give Will Levis the opportunity, even though it might make you worse at the quarterback position. And also, if you lose, look at it as positive. You get a higher draft pick. So I think Will Levis should start the remainder of the season. And just in case he catches magic and starts playing really well, then he can potentially be the future of your franchise. The next game is the Buffalo Bills versus the Detroit Lions. The Bills won 48-42. The Bills' leading passer was Josh Allen, who had 362 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was James Cook, who had 45 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver was Ty Johnson, who had 114 receiving yards. And for the Lions, their leading passer was Jared Goff, who had 494 yards and 5 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Jahmyr Gibbs, who had 31 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Amon-Ra St. Brown, who had 193 yards and a touchdown. So this was a really good game. So it was kind of interesting. The Bills kind of put their foot on the gas and never let up. Both these teams' defenses are very injured and also not very good. And so the Bills, they just kind of scored and kept on scoring. And then the Lions, for most of the game, kind of kept match with them. Josh Allen really played superhuman level at times. Especially at the first half of this game, it felt kind of like a Madden player. You have all his stats at 99 overall, and it's he can just do whatever he wants to and dot your team up. There was a controversial call where about, I believe, 12 minutes left, the Lions were down 10 and went for an onside kick. I know Dan Campbell is getting a lot of hate for it. I might be the only guy to defend it in the sense that I thought it was a good decision. Because the Lions hadn't stopped the Bills at all whatsoever. There was one where it was the end where it just went to halftime, which doesn't really count as a stop in my opinion. And then they made the Bills punt once. So it's clearly your defense is not stopping the Bills' offense. So you might as well try to go for an onside kick to win the game. And you saw when they went for a second one, they nearly got it. This one, Mack Hollins tipped it up to himself, but hey, he got the initial tip in there, so it might have, fumbled it. So I do think it was a good decision for the Lions. And then to talk about the Lions, their kind of bad news gets worse. Well, first of all, their offense did play good. It is kind of funny to me where there was a game earlier against the Texans where Jared Goff threw 5 interceptions and they lost. And they won. And this week, Jared Goff throws 5 touchdowns and they lose. And then they had a couple of big losses. David Montgomery, I think, is the huge one. Here's the thing. Yes, they have tons of players on IR, but I don't really think that's a big deal in the sense that only a couple of them really matter. If their third string defensive tackle is out for the year, they're not going to win or lose any games. Like the Packers, Marshawn Lloyd, who they drafted in either the second or third round, the Packers aren't losing any games they should win just because their third string running back is injured. So in this game, Dave Montgomery goes down towards MCL, out for the year. That is the first real major loss for them on offense because he is a key part of this team and their offense identity. And it's tough because at least they still have Jahmyr Gibbs, so they still have one really good key running back. But their offense just needs to play extremely better and better to overcome their lack of defense. And then on their defense, Ling McNeil goes down, torn ACL, out for the year. And Carlton Davis goes out, broken jaw, out for the year. I do think they can make up their pass rush with a good secondary, so I don't think that Ling McNeil is necessarily the biggest loss in the world, but I think Carlton Davis is a big loss because their corners with Terrion Arnold and Amik Robertson aren't the best, and it's going to be tough because, to make up for their lack of pass rush, they kind of had Kirby Joseph and Brian Branch really playing great at safety role. But now maybe you'll have to transition Branch to potentially a full-time outside corner. That's the only thing that I can think of potentially. Or maybe just leave him at safety and kind of give safety help to whoever the third corner is, who you feel like is the weakest link. I don't know. The Lions' defense is struggling, and who knows if their offense is going to be able to keep pace with that. And that's going to be the question, because I do think this Bills game is going to sum up a lot of the Lions' remainder games, in the sense that they'll have their opponents score a lot of points, and they'll score a lot of points, and who's going to, win at the end. But overall, the Bills, you got to be extremely happy. You are looking like one of the best teams in the league, although your defense really fell apart the last 2 weeks, unfortunately. And the Lions, just the injury news keeps on getting worse and worse and worse. And this game just kind of felt interesting in the sense that the Bills, when they scored a touchdown, it felt like almost instantly every time, like they didn't struggle at all. And then the Lions really felt like they had to fight to earn every single inch they got in this game. So you gotta be really happy if you're the Bills, and just very more disappointed news if you're the Lions. The next game is the Philadelphia Eagles versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Eagles won 27-13. The Eagles' leading passer is Jalen Hurts, who had 290 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Saquon Barkley, who had 65 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was A.J. Brown, who had 110 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the Steelers, their leading passer was Russell Wilson, who had 128 yards and 1 touchdown. Their leading rusher was Najee Harris, who had 14 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Calvin Austin, who had 65 receiving yards. So for this game, there was kind of 2 injuries. TJ Watt went down and AJ Brown went down. It seems like those won't be long-term issues or any major issues for the teams. And then with the Eagles, Jalen Hurts is finally coming back and looking good. This is really his first good game in a while. It seems like he's been struggling quite a lot. And then Saquon Barkley, he was shut down quite a bit, but overall, just the Eagles' offense had really performed out of the usual and definitely played better this week. And then for the Steelers, their offense struggled. Russell Wilson didn't look good. They had no rushing attack whatsoever, and just their offense struggled quite a lot. And this is interesting because a lot of the times it feels like Russell Wilson is just chucking it up to George Pickens, and now that George Pickens is gone, Russell Wilson's been struggling quite a bit. And so overall, I think I don't know when George Pickens is coming back, but it feels like the Steelers really need him. But overall, both these teams are making the playoffs. Pittsburgh really has no shot at the 1 seed. And then the Eagles, you gotta be happy because now you're tied with the Lions, you're tied with the Vikings, and the 1 seed in the NFC is really heating up on which of those 3 of those teams could be. The next game is the Arizona Cardinals versus the New England Patriots. The Cardinals won 30-17. The Cardinals' leading passer is Kyler Murray, who had 224 yards. Their leading rusher was James Conner, who had 110 yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver is Trey McBride, who had 87 receiving yards. And then for the Patriots, their leading passer was Drake May, who had 202 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Ramondre Stevenson, who had 69 rushing yards. Their leading receiver is Kendrick Bourne, who had 44 receiving yards. So for this game, the Cardinals looked really good. Kyler Murray looked great. James Conner looked great. Trey McBride looked great, even though unfortunately he did just break the record for most catches in the season without a touchdown. But overall, this is kind of what you've been waiting for if you are the Cardinals. Just a game where they look good again. Like, they've had a couple of really, really great games this year, and then they've kind of fallen apart in recent weeks. And now you're finally going back to looking good again, and that's what they need. So when you're trying to make the playoffs as the Cardinals, this is kind of the game you really need to do better in. And they did. They played really well. And maybe this will lead to better games in the season. And for the Patriots, I think you got to be really happy with this performance. Drake May looks really, really good. And he has all season, and you keep losing. And that's positive because you're going to get better draft picks. And honestly, I think if they get, like, let's just say the number 2 or number 3 overall pick, they need to trade it. Because Drake May looks great. Ramondre Stevenson looks kind of off and on. And then on defense, Christian Gonzalez looks great. And then everything else, just, you kind of need to blow it up. Like, nobody else is really good. Their whole offense is kind of terrible. Their whole defense is kind of terrible. There's so many issues for the Patriots that it's going to be really hard to solve. But at least Drake May looks good, and you're still losing, so that's good. And at least the Cardinals are looking good because you're still trying to make the playoffs. The next game is the Denver Broncos versus the Indianapolis Colts. The Broncos won 31-13. The Broncos' leading passer was Bo Nix, who threw for 130 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. Their leading rusher is Bo Nix, who had 23 rushing yards, and their leading receiver is Courtland Sutton, who had 32 receiving yards and a touchdown. And then for the Colts, the leading passer was Anthony Richardson, who had 172 yards and 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Jonathan Taylor, who had 107 yards. And their leading receiver is Michael Pittman, who had 58 receiving yards. So in this game, neither quarterback really looked that good. Bo Nix looked really bad. He started settling in and looking better at the end, but overall he just looked pretty bad throughout this game. And luckily you won, and that's the main thing. Just your offense really needs to step up in this game. And then on the other side, the Colts, Jonathan Taylor. This is even more inexcusable than the Jordan Battle fumble. Just as he's crossing the line, he fumbles it, and it goes out of bounds. It's just unacceptable. Like I said earlier, just make everyone run to the back of the end zone. Run that extra, 4 or 5 yards, just to ensure you have a touchdown. It makes no sense. It's inexcusable. And at that point, they're up, I believe it was something like 13-3, and it would have been like 19-3. And at that point, it could have been all the momentum going to the Colts and really sealing this game away. And the Broncos just kind of, or not the Broncos, the Colts just kind of blew it. And then the Broncos, they are looking better. They did get that fumble recovery return for a touchdown off a kind of a bad backwards pass. And just overall, the Broncos defense looks great. Their offense did struggle a bit in this game, and they need to improve. And then the Colts, their defense and offense both kind of struggled this game. Just overall, you need to play better. You're going to be out of the playoffs, and the Broncos are going to make the playoffs. And it's going to be interesting what the Broncos can do in the playoffs. It just depends on what version of Bo Nix you get. Because some games he's been playing really great, and then other games like this where he struggles quite a bit. The next game is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus the Los Angeles Chargers. The Buccaneers won 40-17. The Buccaneers' leading passer is Baker Mayfield, who threw for 288 yards, 4 touchdowns, and an interception. Their leading rusher is Bucky Irving, who had 117 rushing yards, and their leading receiver is Mike Evans, who had 159 yards and 2 touchdowns. For the Chargers, their leading passer is Justin Herbert, who had 195 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. Their leading rusher is Gus Edwards, who had 23 rushing yards. Their leading receiver is Ladd McConkey, who had 58 receiving yards. So in this game, the Buccaneers just dominated. They looked really good. Baker Mayfield's on fire and looked great. Bucky Irving looked great. Mike Evans looked great. This was all around, felt like almost a near perfect game by the Buccaneers. Especially Baker Mayfield looked really, really good. And then the Chargers, I think there's a lot of cause for concern. Because I do believe the Buccaneers and Chargers will both probably make the playoffs. But it seems like your offense is struggling a lot. Who knew how much J.K. Dobbins mattered to their offense? Because it felt like their offense was really just kind of run through him. And now Gus Edwards is not doing anything as a running back. Kamani Vidal is not doing anything as a running back. And just overall, their offense is struggling a lot. It feels like it's only Justin Herbert and Ladd McConkey. And if you shut down Ladd McConkey, he has nobody. So overall, you got to be really happy for the Buccaneers. You're really starting to heat it up come playoff time. And then for the Chargers, you've been slowing it down. And I do think they're kind of like the Texans in the sense that I find it hard to believe that they're not going to be a one and done unless they play the Texans. Because the Chargers, they've just been struggling quite a lot. And they do have a good record, but it really feels like their team is not on par with their record. And just overall, they need to play better. The next game is the Green Bay Packers versus the Seattle Seahawks. The Packers won 30-13. The Packers' leading passer was Jordan Love, who threw for 229 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Josh Jacobs, who had 94 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver is Christian Watson, who had 56 receiving yards. And for the Seahawks, their leading passer is Geno Smith, who had 149 yards and an interception. Their leading rusher is Zach Charbonnet, who had 54 yards and 1 touchdown. Their leading receiver is Jackson Smith-Njigba, who had 83 receiving yards. So in this game, the Packers just kind of dominated all the way through. They got up early at the beginning and looked great. And then it was kind of interesting in the sense that before half, they did play a little bit conservatively in the sense that they could have probably gone down and scored a touchdown, but they basically just wanted to drain the entire clock, and then just end the game, or go to half and kick the field goal, which I do think is probably the right decision. I know a lot of people criticize Matt LaFleur for not being more aggressive, but once you're up, I think they're up either 17-3 or, yeah, I think they was 17-3. At that point, you just want to end the game. You don't need to try to go for more touchdowns and risk fumbles and interceptions. You just want to end the game as early as possible and try not to make any mistakes. So I did think it was a good decision going for the field goal and not going for the touchdown at the end there. And then the big story is Geno Smith did get injured. It is unclear how bad his injury is. He seemed to be jogging, even though he was limping. But Sam Howell came in and didn't look good, and Geno Smith really didn't look good. This is kind of the story of the Packers all the way, where Josh Jacobs played really great. Jordan Love played really great. Christian Watson had a couple of good catches. Romeo Doubs had one amazing touchdown catch where he just at the point where he just hauled it in, and it was a really good touchdown catch to the point where I didn't even think it was a touchdown, but it was, and just really good job. And then the Packers defense just dominated. Adrian Cooper looks like an absolute stud, played amazing. Kingsley Enagbare played great. Rashawn Gary and uh, Carl Brooks, Lucas Van Ness all played really good. And then Carrington Valentine finally got his first career interception. It was kind of weird because it felt like Geno Smith just threw it right to him, and then he dropped it, and then Geno Smith just was like, okay, I'm sorry you dropped it. Let me just throw it right to you again, and he finally picks it off. Didn't make a lot of sense, but overall, the Packers just looked really good, and they needed this. It's like a statement-defining, really great win. And the Seahawks, even though they may or may not make the playoffs, I think probably not. It's going to be tough, but I think they're just in trouble, and Geno Smith, you might have to move on to him. Maybe not after the season, but you're going to have to start looking within the next year or two to probably look for his replacement. The next game is the Minnesota Vikings versus the Chicago Bears. The Vikings won 30-12. The Vikings' leading passer was Sam Darnold, who threw for 231 yards, one touchdown, one interception. Their leading rusher was Aaron Jones, who had 86 rushing yards and a touchdown. Their leading receiver was Justin Jefferson, who had 73 yards and a touchdown. And for the Bears, their leading passer was Caleb Williams, who had 191 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher was DeAndre Swift, who had 79 yards. And their leading receiver is Keenan Allen, who had 82 receiving yards and a touchdown. So in this game, the Vikings looked great, and the Bears just didn't. Kind of plain and simple. Sam Darnold threw a bad interception, but other than that, he looked really good. Aaron Jones looked great. Justin Jefferson looked like a wide open touchdown and just plain and simple dropped it. Really bad drop by him, but other than that, it looked really good. And then the Bears, Caleb Williams really just hasn't been playing that well. Keenan Allen had one amazing sideline catch, but other than that, the Bears just aren't looking good. DeAndre Swift had a decent game, but overall, it's kind of plain and simple in the sense that the Vikings are a good team and the Bears aren't. I thought since it was a divisional matchup, it would be much closer, but it wasn't. And just overall, yeah, like I said, the Bears just didn't play well. It'll be interesting about what they do with Thomas Brown, because it feels like some coaches just aren't like head coach material. Like they fired their offensive coordinator and hired him as offensive coordinator, and he was really, really great as their offensive coordinator. Their offense was moving, looking good, and then the minute he became head coach, their offense has just struggled and failed. And it's kind of inexcusable. I really don't know what's going on with that, but maybe he's just not a head coach guy, but a great offensive coordinator guy. Like, it kind of reminds me a little bit of like Vic Fangio, or maybe this is why Ben Johnson doesn't want to take a head coaching job. Just there's guys who are great coordinators, but just aren't like head coach material. So just the Bears, they're doing horrible, and it's going to be interesting if Thomas Brown can make himself the new head coach. Probably not. And then the Vikings, they just keep winning and looking good, and it's going to be a very interesting battle for the 1 seed. Like, I think it's going to be very fascinating if this is potential. The last week of the season, Vikings and Lions, winner gets the 1 seed and the North. Going to be very interesting how this season ends. The next game, the final game of the week, is the Atlanta Falcons versus the Las Vegas Raiders. The Falcons won 15-9. The Falcons' leading passer was Kirk Cousins, who threw for 112 yards, one touchdown, one interception. Their leading rusher was Bijan Robinson, who had 125 rushing yards. Their leading receiver is Drake London, who had 53 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the Raiders, their leading passer was Desmond Ridder, who had 208 yards, one touchdown, two interceptions. Their leading rusher was Desmond Ridder, who had 28 rushing yards, and their leading receiver is Jacoby Myers, who had 59 receiving yards. So, in this game, neither team really looked good, and this is a problem for Kirk Cousins. So, this was all I see a lot of people talking about is, should the Falcons bench Kirk Cousins for Michael Penix Jr.? Honestly, no, because at this point, it's going to be close if they make the playoffs or not. And you gave Kirk Cousins all this money, and you invested so much into Kirk Cousins that I think at this point you're kind of stuck with him, and you need to keep him. And also, he started off bad, and then there was like a 3 week stretch where he was like the best quarterback in the NFL, and then now he's kind of back to being bad. And just at this point, you are still trying to win a Super Bowl. I don't think it's very likely. I don't think they can do it, but you're trying to win a Super Bowl. And who gives you a better shot at winning a Super Bowl? Michael Penix Jr. or Kirk Cousins? And I still think it's Kirk Cousins. He does need to play better. And I don't know what's wrong with him, where he was playing really great, and then all of a sudden he's now just decided to struggle. He just needs to play better. And the Raiders, it's kind of good that you lost because you're going to try to get your quarterback for the future, maybe Shadir Sanders. And just overall, just got to keep on losing. That's the main thing, what you want, to try to get the best draft pick possible. So that's what happened in Week 15 of the NFL season. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to hit that subscribe button like it owes you money. I'll see you on the next one.